courting Capitol Hill Republicans. VP nominee Mike Pence discusses prayer and Donald Trump with his former colleagues. Slain priest remembered. The Pope to celebrate Mass for the victim of a French terror attack. Humanitarian crisis. Aid groups take advantage of a break in Syria's civil war. And interfaith dialogue, revisiting Benedict XVI's comments on Islam 10 years later. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, September 13th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Indiana Governor Mike Pence talks about praying with Donald Trump. That's one point the vice presidential nominee shared with Republicans today while visiting Capitol Hill. Jason Calvi spoke with lawmakers about this mix of prayer and politics. Jason?
Brian, some big-name Republicans here at the Capitol still have not endorsed Donald Trump. Today, Governor Pence comes here to reassure Republicans that their vision for the future is the same as Donald Trump's. Republican vice presidential nominee Mike Pence meets behind closed doors with House Republicans.
We talked a lot about winning an election.
Pence also told personal stories of Donald Trump.
So this after the convention, they spent 3 days together, and when they departed after those 3 days, Trump was like, hey, we got to pray before we leave. And so the two families sat down and prayed together.
Pence talked with senators, including a private meeting with Ted Cruz. Governor Pence endorsed Cruz in Indiana's presidential primary, but Cruz hasn't yet endorsed Trump.
Are you any closer to endorsing?
I will say this, recent weeks have made clear that Hillary Clinton is manifestly unfit to be president of the United States. When you see Hillary Clinton stand up and describe tens of millions of Americans as deplorables.
Illinois Republican Adam Kinzinger also hasn't backed Trump, but calls Pence a great man of faith.
You know, I have concerns about Donald Trump when it comes to foreign policy, but I think he picked a good vice presidential contender.
So does that make you ready to get on the Trump train then?
Not yet.
But Wisconsin's Sean Duffy, a Trump supporter, says the personal stories can help those jittery about their nominee.
I think you look at Michael Pence coming in, who's a social conservative, a man of faith, former Catholic. When he talked about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's faith and the two of them praying together, that's meaningful for our conference because we have a lot of people of faith in the conference.
Today's visit is a homecoming of sorts for Pence. He served in Congress for 12 years.
I leave here today with a grateful heart to be among my friends and those men and women that I hope and pray we have the opportunity to work together and to make this country great again.
We don't know if Senator Cruz will vote or even endorse Donald Trump. He didn't give a very clear no to both of those questions today. And for the Trump skeptics in the Senate, now they have a direct line to the vice presidential nominee Pence. He passed out his personal cell phone number to all the Republican senators today. Brian?
Interesting visit. Great story. Thank you, Jason. As Hillary Clinton recovers from pneumonia, President Obama and others keep her campaign moving. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is getting more mileage from a controversial comment she made Friday. The clock is ticking with just 8 weeks to go until Election Day. And even though Hillary Clinton is taking the day off to recover from pneumonia,
I'm feeling so much better.
The campaign has plenty of big names hitting the trail on her behalf.
I would trust Hillary Clinton with my son's life, and Donald Trump scares me to death.
And taking Donald Trump to task.
Trump's got support from, working folks. Really? This is the guy you want to be championing working people? We cannot afford suddenly to treat this like a reality show.
And while the Trump campaign is wishing Clinton a speedy recovery, it continues to hammer her for calling some Trump supporters a basket of deplorables.
While my opponent slanders you as deplorable and irredeemable, I call you hardworking American patriots who love your country.
Meanwhile, the children of both campaigns are returning to the trail, with Chelsea Clinton speaking in the battleground state of North Carolina and Ivanka Trump helping her father roll out his child care affordability policy in Pennsylvania. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Former Israeli President Shimon Peres suffers a serious stroke. The 1994 Nobel Peace Prize winner is now in a medically induced coma. The 93-year-old Peres held virtually every senior political office in Israel over a 7-decade career. He served 3 terms as prime minister. He did stints as foreign minister and finance minister. Germany announces the arrest of 3 terror suspects. The country's interior minister believes ISIS sent the Syrians to Germany to carry out an attack. The suspects apparently had not yet formed a concrete plan. Investigators say the Syrians appear to have indirect connections with those involved in the Paris attacks. Pope Francis will celebrate a requiem mass for Father Jacques Hamel tomorrow morning. The 86-year-old was slain by 2 men professing loyalty to the Islamic State while he celebrated Mass in July. There are already some requests that the Pope consider declaring the French priest a martyr. Tomorrow's Mass at the Casa Santa Marta, where Pope Francis lives, will be broadcast live. The Dalai Lama says there should be dialogue with ISIS extremists to end bloodshed in Syria and Iraq. The Tibetan Buddhist spiritual leader spoke today in Paris, where he's attending a week-long conference. He says religion is never a justification for killing, and dialogue is the only way to peace. Catholic aid groups say the ceasefire in Syria is enabling them to get food and medicine to people who desperately need it. The head of Caritas in Syria says they're now praying the ceasefire will hold. Wyatt Goolsby reports.
Brian, Chaldean Catholic Bishop Antoine Odu says volunteers with Caritas in Syria are working to get humanitarian aid into Aleppo. Many people there are still caught in the crossfire, and it's been difficult to reach certain parts of the city.
For the most part, the U.S.-Russia brokered ceasefire is holding, with only sporadic and minor violations reported in various parts of Syria. Speaking to Vatican Radio, Bishop Odu says Syrians hope it's the beginning of the end of the civil war. The bishop saying everyone, especially here in Aleppo, is awaiting this change. We are hoping. We have been suffering for 6 years, and we are hoping for signs of peace and reconciliation. He says a pause in the fighting is critical in getting humanitarian assistance into the besieged city. Half of Aleppo is controlled by the government, half by the rebels. Many aid organizations, including the United Nations, have not delivered food and supplies.
We need to enter an environment where we are not in mortal danger as deliveries, as humanitarian organizations delivering aid.
Turkey's state-run news agency says a total of 40 UN trucks carrying food and clothes are set to cross the border into Syria tonight, on their way towards Aleppo. The ceasefire seems fragile. The Russian military is accusing U.S.-backed rebels of repeatedly violating the agreement. But Turkey says it's Syrian troops that are not abiding by the ceasefire. Bishop Odu says he agrees with Pope Francis, who says the solution must be political, not military.
Bishop Odu says the Christian community in Syria welcomes the ceasefire, but is skeptical it will last. Brian?
Thank you, Wyatt Goolsby. President Obama promises to veto a bill giving families of 9/11 victims the right to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts. Both the House and Senate unanimously passed that legislation by voice vote. The White House insists there are risky global implications for the United States.
This law actually opens up the United States to risk of being hauled into court in countries around the world.
Congress appears to have enough bipartisan votes to override a presidential veto. A new report claims the U.S. has spent nearly $5 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A Brown University professor calculated the costs. They range from the Department of Defense budget to financial support for wounded veterans. Amber Smith, author of the new book Danger Close, a memoir of her time as an active combat helicopter pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan. Amber is with us tonight. Is $5 trillion a reasonable price to pay for our national security? And what about the financial burden to future generations?
Well, that's a big price tag, and I think it's important to remember what goes into that. So it's 2 different wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, starting back 2001, 2003, up to today's date. But it also includes the VA's budget. So it includes when veterans go to war, they come home, and then getting in the VA, getting in the healthcare system, and sort of taking care of our warriors after they come back from war. And so it's important to remember that our freedom isn't free. Not only does it cost blood and sacrifice with our soldiers who wear the uniform, but it also is a high dollar item for our taxpayers.
Well, thank you and all of our veterans for your service. How do you think America has changed in these 15 years? The world really has changed since 9/11. And what has our military done in that process?
So the world's still a very dangerous place. I think that the U.S. military has done a significant job, a great job in the Middle East in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan. But we've learned a lot. We've learned that the terrorist threat is constantly evolving and that we have to adapt as well to the threat, not only overseas, but here at home. We've seen the terrorist threat here in our homeland rise. We saw the Boston bombings, the San Bernardino attacks, the attack in Orlando. So the threat is still alive and well today, and it exists. And as a nation and society, we have to ensure that we don't become complacent. That then is helping the terrorists out in terms of sort of complacent society. So it's important to stay vigilant and aware of the threats we face today.
I think most Americans agree we need to protect our country, but should we police the world? And if not us, who?
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of being the world police, but what we need to do is we have national security interests. And I think that when there are threats around the world that threaten our national security in any manner, that we have to address that. We can't run from the threats that face us. And so sometimes, war is a terrible thing, but sometimes it is necessary to go in and eliminate a threat. And so that's sort of, I think, what you have to remember. And there is a difference between nation building and stabilization, and I think that that's a little bit where people get concerned when it comes to intervention is the aftermath.
I can't wait to read your book, Danger Close, your memoir. As an active helicopter pilot, both your sisters are pilots as well. Amber Smith, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, President Obama pressures Congress to approve Zika funding despite disagreement over Planned Parenthood. And protecting the unborn, a new push to ban late-term dismemberment abortion. Today, September 13th, we celebrate St. John Chrysostom, a doctor of the church. He's regarded as one of the greatest preachers in church history. Chrysostom actually means golden-mouthed. Thanks for joining us this Tuesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Florida Governor Rick Scott comes to D.C. hoping to convince lawmakers to pass a Zika funding bill. His visit follows President Obama's meeting Monday with congressional leaders. They're trying to break an impasse after Democrats insist some of the Zika money should be used to fund Planned Parenthood. That's just one of the political riders added to the bill to fight the Zika virus.
Zika doesn't have anything to do with a Confederate flag, and Zika doesn't have anything to do with defunding Planned Parenthood.
We need a clean solution here to a messy problem. This should not be a political problem. This should be a healthcare problem and a life problem and not a political problem on Capitol Hill.
Zika funding may be included in a must-pass spending bill to keep the government running beyond the current budget agreement. Well, there is a renewed effort to ban gruesome late-term dismemberment abortions in the U.S. Oklahoma Republican James Lankford recently introduced the Dismemberment Abortion Ban Act in the U.S. Senate. The House is considering a similar bill. Oklahoma Senator James Lankford joining us from his Capitol Hill office. Senator, explain, if you will, how this accepted abortion procedure is especially disturbing.
Well, this procedure is no different than other procedures for late-term abortions. We as a nation determined several years ago we don't do partial birth abortion, which takes a late-term abortion, delivers the child, and literally kills them with them half delivered. Dismemberment abortion is another late-term abortion procedure where the child is too big for a normal abortion procedure, so they literally reach into the womb and they dismember the child, and then they be able what's called vacate the child out in parts. Rather than to be able to deliver them partially and then to be able to kill the child. So it's a very horrific process. We as America have already determined that partial birth abortion is horrific. We're not going to do that. I've identified this as another method that's out there that is a very common late-term abortion method that I also think when most Americans saw it and knew about it, they would say that is not something that we need to do as a nation.
Abortion is such a divisive political issue. Does this bill have a chance of passage?
This bill probably will not pass in this session. What I've tried to do is to be able to put it out late in the session to start the conversation, to try to build the momentum for a future conversation and vote on this in a future session. We have found consensus in areas like late-term abortion and the partial birth abortion ban, and so I'm trying to look for other areas of consensus. There's also a bill that's moving as well, and there's a lot of conversation about if an abortion is botched and the child is actually delivered and the child is alive, should we protect that life? I believe strongly that life should be protected. There are others that would disagree with that. We're trying to find the common agreement to say if an abortion is botched, should we protect that child? Yes, I think we can find common ground on that. I hope we can also find common ground on this area. Looking forward to the day when we recognize every child as valuable and we protect every child. At this point, let's protect as many children as we can.
And would the legislation that you've introduced give mothers of aborted babies any additional rights?
Those mothers would still retain the same rights. This really deals with the physicians that are in the practice. So we're not trying to go after directly after any mothers or criminalize any kind of behavior from what's happening there. This deals with physicians telling them what practice is legal and is not legal and criminalizing a particular form of how abortion is done.
But mothers would be able to file civil suits in these cases.
Yes, that's correct. Mothers would be able to file civil suits if this procedure was performed on them, because it's obviously would be an illegal procedure, and that mothers would be able to step in and say something was done to me that was not done legally and was done to my child, and they would have civil opportunities to protect themselves and their own rights.
Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Glad to be able to visit with you today.
In reaction tonight to the NCAA decision to remove championship sports events from North Carolina, the Faith and Freedom Coalition accuses the NCAA of dedicating itself to left-wing and special interest politics. North Carolina's law protecting privacy in bathrooms, locker rooms, and shower facilities also cost the state the NBA All-Star Game. A suburban Pittsburgh school board will no longer allow students to use bathrooms based on their expressed gender identity. The Pine Richland School Board's new policy requires students to use bathrooms corresponding to their biological sex or use unisex restrooms. The U.S. Department of Education warns school districts could lose federal funding for not complying with its directive. Some conservative members of Congress formally introduced a resolution to impeach IRS Commissioner John Koskinen. The measure, which lacks support even among Republicans, was put into play today under special procedures. A House vote could come as early as Thursday. Senate Democrats have enough votes to prevent Republicans from removing Koskinen from office if it gets that far. Koskinen denies allegations he hampered efforts to investigate the IRS for tough assessments of Tea Party groups seeking tax-exempt status. Up next, Vatican leaders discuss prayer for peace, uniting Pope Francis with religious leaders globally. And 10 years ago today, Benedict XVI sparked a new conversation about Islam. Pope Francis says we must create a culture of encounter, seeing the suffering around us and doing something to help. At this morning's Santa Marta Mass, Francis says we should allow ourselves to be moved by pity and donate at the very least a drop of life. Thank you for joining us this Tuesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. A College Park, Maryland school bus driver helps all 20 of her student passengers escape from a burning bus. Rainietta Smith says she smelled smoke on her last run Monday, then saw fire from her side view mirror. She stopped the bus, escorting each child ages 4 to 9 to safety as neighbors helped keep the kids calm. It's not yet clear what started that fire. Dozens of Italian students are back in class for the first time since the August earthquake that killed 295 people and left thousands homeless. Classes for students ranging from preschool to middle school are being held in shipping containers. Amatrice's schools crumbled in the quake, despite having been retrofitted for anti-seismic improvements. The quake occurred in the early morning hours during summer break. The makeshift school is built on an open field. Pope Francis will attend the final meeting of the World Day of Prayer for Peace next Tuesday in Assisi. Today, the Vatican gave us more information about the huge interfaith event. It will feature 450 religious leaders from around the world. Among those attending, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew.
We know that it's a globalized world, but with many problems, with many wars, and the unity of all the people, all the believers, can make the difference.
We will be united, searching for peace, praying for peace with Pope Francis, and representing all the people that at the moment are suffering for war, for violence, for terrorism.
And today marks the 10th anniversary of Benedict XVI's controversial speech in Regensburg, Germany. He took a firm stand against radical Islam, saying, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." Father Robert Gall is a professor of ethics at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross there in Rome, joining us now. Father, what impact did Benedict's speech have on the Church's relationship with Muslims?
Immediately after his speech, things went a little bit crazy out there in the world. There were nuns who were attacked in various countries. And a lot of people were shocked by what the Pope said, and they misinterpreted it because they got it from the headlines when Pope Benedict made that comment about Islam. But subsequently, there's been a real effort on the part of the Vatican to have a more peaceful dialogue, and that has ensued.
How was his speech received in the West, Father?
Well, in the West, unfortunately, people saw just a big headline regarding his comment regarding Islam, and yet his speech was primarily directed to us in the West, and he was responding against an empiricistic, materialistic mentality that isn't capable of seeing God's creative power in this world. And hopefully now people would begin to read it more seriously.
So is his call for dialogue between reason and faith more or less relevant today?
It's even more relevant, in fact, much more relevant. Today, for instance, regarding gender ideology that is dominating so many features of our discussion, we need to get back to reality, get back even to metaphysics, get back to being, and recognize that God is the creator of all these good things that we're dealing with, and there is reality. That's what Pope Benedict was challenging the West, was to broaden our horizons and open our intellects and have that daring to see being and to recognize the beauty in God's creation.
And how has Pope Francis continued the Catholic Church's outreach to Muslims?
Pope Francis has used a very different style, and yet the content is very much an extension of what Pope Benedict was trying to do. And his style is emblematic, and it's exemplified by what he's going to do tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, Pope Francis announced that he's going to celebrate a special Mass, a commemorative Mass, for Father Jacques Hamel, who was martyred, it seems executed in France out of hatred for Christianity by those Islamic terrorists. So Pope Francis advances the dialogue by showing that the Christian faith, the Catholic Church, offers compassion and love to all people.
Father Robert Gall joining us from Rome. He's with the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross. Father, we thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brian.
And Pope Francis receives an autographed Pittsburgh Steelers football. Father Douglas Nowicki, a Benedictine monk, presented it to Francis at the Vatican. He is Chancellor of St. Vincent College near Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The Steelers have held training camp there for more than 40 years. That ball is signed by team owners, several players, and coach Mike Tomlin. A Brazilian couple has enough sons for an entire soccer team with 2 to spare. This couple vowed to keep trying for a girl until 2 years ago when their 13th son was born on the oldest boy's 18th birthday. The boys are all named after professional soccer players whose names start with the letter R. They look pretty good, too. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night. God bless.